Hi, and welcome back to my channel, where I'm going to cover the Cleric's Tempest Domain, a class specialization from the 5th edition Dungeons & Dragons Player's Handbook module. Clerics are one of the core classes within Dungeons & Dragons, and have been there for all of the editions that Wizards of the Coast has published. With 5th edition, there are a number of class specializations that you can choose from, and in this video we will be going over the Tempest Domain. Clerics, however, work a little differently than other classes when it comes to their class specialization, in that clerics don't gain as many base features as other classes, but they do gain more features and abilities through their class specializations than what other classes get. Additionally, many of the features gained by the domain will typically complement or increase the effectiveness of many of the base class features. For instance, all clerics gain multiple domain-specific spells that do not need to be clerical in nature. However, they will function as a clerical spell while it is being cast. It is also the domain that fleshes out to the channel Divinity feature and adds capabilities to it that complement the underlying premise of the domain itself. As I've said before, I'm going to only focus on the levels where something is gained and is specific to the Tempest Domain, as the bulk of the features and changes that your cleric will receive that are not domain-specific have already been covered with the base class videos for the cleric. If you have not yet watched those videos, I will be sure to provide a link in the description below for you to use to gain access to them. With that in mind, let's take a look at the domain itself. Clerics gain their class specialization, or domain, at level 1, and this is due to the way that clerics gain access to their spells. When earlier editions were published, the concept was that clerics would call upon their gods to cast their spells. The gods would then use the cleric's body and soul to channel that spell to its inevitable conclusion, and it was the cleric's prayer, or the act of casting the spell, that allowed that connection to happen. As I've stated before, with 5th edition, the gods are less involved, but they still grant their worshipping clerics the means to cast spells on their behalf. Instead of the cleric themselves being the focal point of the spell, they now use a foci, much like other spellcasters of this edition, and it's the foci that acts as the origin point for the spell. And all of this ties into the god you have chosen for your character to worship, with respect to the domain. How you choose a god for your character to worship is up to you, but in 5th edition, the domain is used as a guidepost through the suggested domains column here that you see on this table. The Player's Handbook module contains an appendix called Appendix B that contains all of the gods of the multiverse, and it lists all of the various gods for each of the realms that have been published within the Dungeons & Dragons sphere. It doesn't, however, mean you can't select a god whose suggested domain is different than the one you have chosen. But as I indicated in the base class videos, if your selected god has no relationship to the domain that you have chosen, there could be, from a role-playing point of view, issues casting some of those spells. Gods might simply refuse to grant the spell unless it in some way aligns with some otherworldly goal that that god has in mind, for instance. With respect to the clerics of the Tempest Domain, they gain access to some highly destructive, elemental-based spells from other non-clerical spell sources, in addition to the few that the clerics already have access to. They are meant to use these destructive forces to instill some level of fear into others to keep them on a clear path within their lives, or simply avoid the wrath of the gods. As such, there is quite a bit of leeway with this class, giving you, the player, a high level of flexibility as to how it should be played. And I mean that with respect to alignments. While it does have a leaning towards an evil connotation using these powers as a means of control, it can be used lawfully to ensure that folks remain on the right path. However, in order for me to continue with the rest of this video, and because the clerics select their domain at level 1, I've gone ahead and entered in all of my stats and selected the race and gotten that out of the way. I'm now going to go ahead and choose the cleric class, and as soon as I do that, it's going to prompt with both clerical skill proficiencies as well as cleric specialization selections. I'm just going to quickly throw in a couple of proficiencies there, and then I'm going to select the Tempest Domain. As soon as I do that, we get no additional selections through this particular class specialization, but I'm going to go ahead and finish off the rest of this class off screen and bring you back once we're ready to cover the first feature. At level 1, your character is going to gain access to 3 features, one called Tempest Domain Spells, another called Bonus Proficiency, and a third called Wrath of the Storm. But first, we're going to cover the domain-specific spells your character is going to gain as part of this domain by looking at the Tempest Domain Spells feature. At level 1, your character is going to automatically gain access to the Fog Cloud and Thunderwave spells, adding to those that you get to choose during your character creation. These spells, however, are meant to complement those spells you can select during character creation while you're actually leveling your character up at later levels. Because of this, they do not count against the total number of spells that your character can prepare. And this means that you can choose to use any of these spells as long as your character has the correct level to be able to cast them and has a matching spell slot to be able to use them. To help differentiate between the spells that you have selected during character creation, which you'll see here at the bottom, versus those that you gain through your domain, I recommend something called a spell group. When we drag Fog Cloud into here, and I'll show you that right now, it's going to automatically drop into this spell group here. We don't necessarily want that because at some point in the future, you might choose to rotate out the spells that you currently have selected, and you might unintentionally remove this from this list, and that's not something that's supposed to happen. To help support the prevention of that, what we can do is move this into its own spell group. I'm going to call it Tempest Domain Spells. Now, initially when this is done, it's going to move this to what's called a power group, and that's not what we want. We'll have to make an adjustment to this group by modifying the group itself. And you do that by opening up or clicking on this magnifying glass, and it's going to pop this window open here. We want to change the group type from abilities, which is what it is when you see the sword, to spells, which is what it's going to be when you see the book here. We also want to make sure that the ability is set up to use wisdom, and that's because that's what clerics use for their spellcasting capabilities. And we don't need to make any further adjustments there. We can then drag Thunderwave into place. And that's going to automatically add it to this particular spell group. And essentially what we have done is we have now created two separate spell groups. This was created when we created our character, and the cantrips and these level 1 spells here are in what's called a linked spell group. This Tempest Domain Spells is a group right now, but it will not be classified as a linked group until we actually add in these two spells here, Gust of Wind and Shatter. And I'll explain that once we get there. But when it comes to this, we're pretty much set up. The question is, how do you use them? Nothing really differs when it comes to casting Tempest-specific spells or domain-specific spells, in the sense that it doesn't matter whether you're casting spells from this group or this group, they're all going to consume a spell slot. The only real difference is that with your domain spells, you don't need to prepare them, unlike this group here. So if I actually go here, click on these little check marks here, so I'm in preparation mode, and then I go into a combat and actions group, we can see that we have a prepared group of spells. If I uncheck these and we go back into actions or combat and actions, you'll see that that level 1 group isn't there. Our domain-specific spell group is, but the normal spell group is not. So you'll always want to make sure that for those you select, you choose to prepare them. Casting the spells is fairly simple. What you want to do is target something. So in this particular case, I'm going to target the Shadow Daemon. And I'm holding down the control key, the left control key, and then left clicking on the mouse button. This allows me to select that as a target, and you can see that I have now got the Shadow Daemon as a target in my selection list there. I'm then simply going to click on this to force that daemon, or demon I should say, to make a roll, and it failed the saving throw. The one thing I want to point out is you will see two specific kinds of conditions when it comes to someone that has to make a saving throw. Something that has an H here and something that doesn't. If there's an H, that means that whoever fails a saving throw is only going to suffer half damage. If this H is not there, they're simply going to be missed or not suffer any damage. But in this case, the Shadow Demon failed, which means they're going to take the full brunt of the damage. So I'm going to go ahead and hit them with that. Before I finish this particular action, however, I now need to make sure that I tick off a spell here. And the reason why you have to do that manually is some of these spells can be cast at higher levels. And here's the problem. Fantasy Grounds doesn't have the ability to detect what level you're casting something at. So you need to be the one who actually selects the spell slot here. So just remember that during your turn. And that's it. That's how spells work for a cleric. Also at Cleric level 1, your character is gaining access to this bonus proficiencies feature. And it's going to give you access to things like martial weapons and heavy armor. Specifically, this feature is granting your character proficiency with heavy armor as well as martial weapons, ensuring that your character can make use of those armor variants and provide a higher level of protection through that. In addition to that, you're gaining access to a wider selection of weapons. If, however, during character creation, you did not realize that capability was there or did not select a weapon that was specific to this particular class of weapons or select the heavy armor, chances are Dungeon Masters will allow you to swap out the equipment that you currently have in place. And I'll show you how to quickly do that here in a moment. First though, we need to ensure that we actually have those proficiencies listed here. In this case, we do. We can see that we have martial weapons that's listed here, as well as heavy armor that has been picked up here. This means that we don't have to make any modifications here. It also means that we should have had those particular weapons and armor items presented to us during character creation. But if you unintentionally selected something that was a simple melee weapon or a lighter class of armor, you can swap them out if you're going to be utilizing them during any of my campaigns, and there are other dungeon masters that might allow you to do that as well, as I said earlier. To do that, what you will want to do is expand out this campaigns button and gain access to this items list. And at the top, you will see these two buttons, armor and weapons. I'm going to pop both of these open and just get everything off the screen there. Perfect. This is where you're going to find those heavier categories of armor, as well as the martial weapons specifically to the proficiency that you just gained. When it comes to the heavy armor, however, chances are only chainmail or splint mail are going to be an item selection within the character sheet. So I'm probably going to restrict that selection to either chainmail or splint if you decide to swap out the one that you had selected. When it comes to the martial weapons, I'm pretty certain that while I was completing off the character creation process, most of these weren't there. So if you want to choose a weapon that's not necessarily in that default selection, if you will, then what you're probably going to want to do is talk to the dungeon master and see if it's going to be an okay selection. And generally that's what I would ask my players to do as well. In any event, let's say that I wanted to swap out the hand axe that I had actually selected during character creation, which is right here, for this great axe. All I would do is I would drop the great axe onto my inventory, and then I would select the hand axe and just simply delete it. As soon as I do that, my selection of weapons is going to update here on our actions page, and I don't really have to set anything up there. And the same thing can be said for armor. You'll see here that I had selected armor during character creation, but maybe I want to go with chainmail instead. All I have to do is drag that into place, delete the leather armor, and then make sure that the chainmail is equipped. And I should probably do the same thing with the great axe, which I believe the great axe automatically equipped itself. Yes, it did. Perfect. You should see an adjustment with your armor class, and you should just do a final double check to make sure that any weapons that you added are in this weapons list here. And finally, the last feature your character gains at level 1 is called Wrath of the Storm. It's a pretty powerful reaction-based feature. This feature is going to allow your character to use their reaction and effectively retaliate against a creature that has hit your character, as long as they are within 5 feet of where your character currently stands, and your character can see them. This means that your character cannot be in darkness and cannot be blind, otherwise you will be unable to use this reaction. What is going to happen is that when that creature hits you, you're going to force that creature, if you choose to use this reaction, to make a dexterity-based saving throw. If they fail, they're going to suffer 2d8 points of lightning damage or thunder damage, which you get to choose at the time that you actually use the reaction. If the creature saved on their saving throw, they're still going to suffer half damage. And the timing for this is going to be as follows. As soon as your character is hit, you will want to execute this reaction, and that is because you could theoretically stave off the incoming damage. And what I mean by that is that once you're hit, if you choose to use the reaction and that reaction kills off the creature that hit you, you get to void the damage, simply because the creature didn't have time to apply. And the reason why I'm making that judgment call is because of this line here, or at least the latter part of it. Hits you with an attack. That doesn't necessarily mean that they've applied damage, because the sentence structure here isn't stating that damage has been applied. So it's theoretically possible for you to actually avoid the damage completely. However, there are going to be dungeon masters that are going to state you got hit, which means your character is going to suffer damage. They won't make this kind of judgment call. So I'm a little bit flexible when it comes to this. However, there are some role-playing situations where I might actually apply damage, if I'm trying to make it a little bit more interesting, for instance. There is, however, a usage limitation to the number of times that your character can use this feature, and it's equal to your character's wisdom modifier. And here's the catch. Because it is a reaction, you won't be able to do this X number of times per turn due to the fact that it's a reaction. So if you have a wisdom modifier of 3, essentially what it means is that you get to use it over the course of 3 turns, not 3 times in a single round. And then once your character has expended all of those uses, they will need to complete a long rest in order to regain those uses. The good news for us is that the feature has already been added here. So we don't have to worry about that. All we have to do is control the number of uses, and that's going to be based off of our character's wisdom modifier, which here is +3. That means that our character has the ability to use this 3 times. I'm going to go ahead and just simply make that modification. With that change, we now see 3 pips here. So the question is, how do you actually use this? Well, I've gone ahead and moved the turn over to the Shadow Daemon, and you can see that I've included the Dungeon Master screen here. With the Shadow Daemon, I'm going to target our Cleric. I now have them targeted, and then I'm going to make an attack. That is definitely a hit. Now what I'm going to do is I'm going to make use of a reaction. And as soon as I do that, I'm going to force this Shadow Daemon to make a saving throw. Interestingly enough, they are doing so with disadvantage, and that's because they actually have a disadvantage here. Not really applicable, but I'll let it slide at this particular point in time, and they happen to have failed. They're going to then suffer one of these 2 kinds of damage, thunder or lightning. I get to choose which one at the time that I cast this. I'm going to choose lightning in this case and drop that into place. With that done, it didn't kill them off, so now the Shadow Daemon can come back and do the damage to our character. Which unfortunately, in this case, kills off our character, but that's because that Shadow Daemon's overleveled for this particular example. And through the magic of editing, our character is once again alive. The last thing we will have to do is actually tick off that we have used this particular feature. And if the Dungeon Master is so inclined, they will then modify your character sheet or your entry within the combat tracker to indicate that you have used your reaction. And what I mean by that is that on the Dungeon Master's version of the combat tracker, if they expand out the offense category here or option, they will see that there's a react here and a little pip next to it. There's just a little check mark that they have to tick to indicate that your reaction has been used. And that's just for tracking purposes. At Cleric level 2, your character is going to gain access to this Channel Divinity feature through the base class. But in addition to that, they're also going to gain access to this Destructive Wrath option for Channel Divinity. And what this particular option gives you is the ability to instantly maximize any amount of thunder or lightning based damage that your character is going to do, thus avoiding any dice rolls to ensure that you're simply going to apply max damage. For example, if you were to use this Wrath of Storms against a particular attacker, then you'd also be able to use the Channel Divinity option to simply add up the amount of damage that you're going to do to be a maximum of 16 points of damage. The catch is that Channel Divinity has a usage limitation, so you can only do this an X number of times before you would not be able to do it again before completing a long or short rest. But otherwise, it's a nice little bump that your character has fairly early on in order to be able to maximize the amount of damage they can do. At later levels, when you get the Call Lightning and even the Destructive Wave spells, this little option maximizes completely the amount of damage that they do. So it's quite insane what you can eventually do with this particular character over time. However, there's one thing to note. If a creature has managed to make their saving throw against one of those spells, so that they will only be suffering half of the normal amount of damage, that is still going to apply. So in the case of Wrath of the Storm, the maximum amount of damage I could do is 16 points of damage, whether it's lightning or thunder damage. A creature still gets a saving throw with respect to that, and if they avoid that, they gain the means to avoid half of the damage, which means they would only suffer 8 points of damage, not the full 16. However, when it comes to Channel Divinity, there's a very specific way that it should be set up. And what you want to do is create a dedicated group for this as well as for this. Even though this is not necessarily something you normally need to track because there's no direct actionable options out of this feature, we do need to track its use. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to set this into standard mode. It was already there. I'm going to set this to group. I'm then going to update this turn on dead group, if you will, in order to reflect the correct group we need to put it in. There we go. I'm then going to drag this feature into there, although it won't directly go. Keep forgetting that with features. Once that's done, there's a couple of things I need to do in order to make a modification to this group for it to function properly. The first is I'm going to get rid of this duplicate portion of Channel Divinity because we only need to know what the feature is. We don't necessarily need to know that it is still a Channel Divinity feature because we already have that defined here. I'm then going to modify this power group. I'm going to make sure that everything is linked against Wisdom, and that it's going to be set up for 1 rest. And as soon as I do that, you're going to see that there's going to be pips that are going to appear next to our Channel Divinity feature. The way this works is that if I choose to use Destructive Wrath, it will also indicate that I've also used Turn on Dead, not because I cast or made use of the Turn on Dead feature, but it's because Channel Divinity shares the uses between these two options. And vice versa. If I go ahead and select that I've used Turn on Dead, Destructive Wrath becomes unavailable. So it does force you to choose what you're going to do with respect to your Channel Divinity options. At this early level, you only have access to 1 use before you have to complete a short or a long rest. At later levels, you gain access to a second at, I believe it's level 6, and then at level 18, I believe that's when you gain your 3rd. So let's go ahead and revisit our initial encounter with the Shadow Daemon. Let's say that we've already gone ahead and rolled the saving throw for Wrath of the Storms here. What I can do is I can choose to use Destructive Wrath and then state that I'm automatically going to use 16 points of damage. The problem is there is no easy way to indicate a maximum damage output with these two settings as they stand. So because of this particular feature, what you will want to do is modify or add in 2 additional damage factors here. I'm going to go ahead and add in 2 new damage elements. I'm going to modify this to simply be 16 points of lightning damage. Oops, if I could spell lightning correctly. And then modify this one to be 16 points thunder damage. Perfect. Now that that's in place, when I go ahead and drop this into place, they're just automatically going to receive this kind of damage. Now, in the case of lightning, they're resistant to it. But in the case of the thunder damage here, they actually suffer damage and have been knocked unconscious and are dying because of that. And that is a perfect example as to why you execute that reaction prior to damage being rolled against your character. At Cleric level 3, your character is going to gain access to their next set of domain spells, and in this case it is Gust of Wind and Shatter. And it's fairly straightforward to go through and add these to your character sheet. I'm going to make sure that all of the other spell groups are minimized for the time being, and then just simply drag and drop these directly into our Tempest Domain spells group. And as soon as I do that, we're going to get a level 2 spell group, and now this is what's called a linked spell group. And the reason why is because if I modify anything about this particular group here, it's actually going to show up as changed here as well. It's not going to show up changed with respect to the normal spell group because that isn't linked to these 2 groups. Now, because I want to make sure that this is configured correctly, I'm going to go ahead and set that back to Wisdom. When you drag a particular domain-specific spell into this particular category here, or these 2 groups, it should automatically calculate the saving throw that someone is going to have to make in order to actually avoid or take only half damage of something. When you first create a particular domain group and drag a spell from here into here, that's when you might have to pop this open in order to correct any values that were already set. Now, generally, it should have been set when it got dropped here correctly, and then moved over here, it should have automatically corrected that, but sometimes it doesn't. So just be aware of that. But as you can see, when it comes to adding in our new domain spells, because of the prep work that we've done earlier, it's fairly easy to add in additional spells. Before we do anything else though, we will want to make a minor adjustment to this Shatter spell. On the off chance that you choose to use your Channel Divinity feature to max out its damage, we want to modify or add an additional damage element to this particular spell to take that into account. In this case, it will be a total of 24 thunder points of damage. And that's all you need to do in order to finalize that configuration for that particular spell. At Cleric level 5, we once again gain access to some additional domain-specific spells. So I'm going to go ahead and simply pop that open and drag and drop these into place. Now, there's one thing that we might want to look at here with respect to preparing for the off chance that you might decide to use your Channel Divinity feature here. We are also going to want to modify this particular spell here because we have the ability to do lightning damage, which means we could theoretically do maximum lightning damage if we chose to use our Channel Divinity feature. So I'm going to go ahead and add in an additional damage effect. And once again, this is going to be 30 points of damage. And it's just going to be of the same type of damage that we're doing here. And this way you don't have to go through and figure out how to automatically maximize it or manipulate any numbers that happen to show up here. All you have to do is just simply drag and drop this onto the creature. And it keeps the overall process of moving combat forward at a fairly quick pace. At Cleric level 6, your character is going to gain access to the Thunderbolt strike feature, which allows your character to potentially push a large to smaller creature up to 10 feet away. What this means is that when your character does lightning-based damage, you can use this feature to push any of those creatures that took damage away from your character up to 10 feet. The only requirements is that they have suffered damage and that they happen to be of the large or smaller category of sizes when it comes to their creature size. For instance, let's say that you use the Call Lightning spell that you gain through level 5 against one or more orcs that might be surrounding your character. When you do that, you will then be able to force all of those creatures back an additional 10 feet as long as they took damage. And because Call Lightning happens to have a half damage requirement here, you're absolutely guaranteed to push all of those creatures back. Regardless of whether they make their saving throw or not, unless they have some other feature that's going to allow them to avoid damage completely, they are going to suffer damage. So if all of those creatures happen to be within 5 feet of your character at the time that you call down lightning on top of them, then what's going to happen is that they're all going to get pushed away 10 feet from where they're currently standing, making them approximately 15 feet away from where your character is. However, if there are obstructions that they will be bumping up against as a result of that, they won't go past that obstruction, and they will not be pushed through that obstruction. For instance, if you happen to be in a room that is only 10 feet around, and you go and push those creatures away, they're only going to get pushed as far as the wall. They will not be pushed through the wall and thus suffer damage because of that. The other thing to make note of is that there is no usage limitation here. It is automatically something that you get to use whenever you do lightning-based damage. So that is the real restriction there, is that you have to cast a spell that does lightning damage, and Call Lightning is a perfect example of that. To show you what that's going to look like, let's say that skeletons 11 and 8 and zombie 10 and 18 here are the only creatures that happen to be around your character, and then you decide to call lightning down on them. As you can see, we have 1 success and 3 failures. All of these creatures are going to automatically be pushed back because they're simply going to suffer their lightning damage. Now, just for giggles, I'm going to go ahead and enable my Channel Divinity feature in the sense that, let's say that I have rested and I have regained its use. When I do that, I'm going to automatically be able to do this when it comes to the amount of damage. So because I've got them all targeted, I'm just simply going to click this. It's going to automatically apply and then deselect any particular creature that took that damage. And unfortunately, I killed them all. So in this particular case, it's just going to push their corpses back 10 feet, which is perfectly fine. That's still legitimate. It frees up the area around you for new creatures to come in. But the point is that once the damage has been done, they would then be pushed back to whatever location the DM feels they got pushed back to in place of a map, which I'm not demonstrating in this particular case. Now, to complete the demonstration off, I have to ensure that I had selected Destructive Wrath as something I had used, and because I had cast a 3rd level spell, I need to make sure that I have that spell slot ticked off. At Cleric level 7, your character is going to gain the next set of domain spells, and in this case it is Control Weather and Ice Storm. And because of the convenience of the spell groups that we already have in place, all I have to do is make sure that I'm on my actions page, drop both of these into place, and then just verify that they aren't doing thunder or lightning based damage, which in this case they are not. So we don't have to make any adjustments to them to take into account anything we might be able to do with our Channel Divinity feature here. At Cleric level 8, your character is going to gain access to their next feature called Divine Strike. And this feature is going to allow your character to add additional damage to any weapon attack that you have made once per turn. And specifically, it is one attack that you make during a particular turn. So if you execute an attack, melee-based attack, or range-based attack, for instance, during your action round, and then later on have to use a reaction, but you use Divine Strike during your action, you would not be able to use Divine Strike during a reaction. What it will do, however, is add 1d8 points of thunder damage to any melee or range-based attack that you do. And yes, this can benefit from your Channel Divinity feature. Because of that, we're going to simply want to make some minor adjustments. Divine Strike is already set up within our action sheet, so we don't need to make any adjustments to that. There is one minor correction we do need to make, though, and that is this should be on next roll. And that is because we want this to go away after we make our melee-based attack, because it's only going to apply to one attack. Next, we will want to ensure that we add in an additional effect to take into account Destructive Wrath. I'm going to go ahead and do this, and simply keep the same kind of formatting that we are using for this. So I'm going to have DMG:8 Thunder. That's going to line up with this, but instead of us doing a dice roll, we're simply specifying the amount of damage that we're going to do. And I'm also going to set this up as self and on next roll. This way, it is configured exactly the same, and you can just apply the right effect at the time that you need it. So the way this feature works is as follows. Let's say that I'm no longer attacking these guys, but I'm attacking this Archmage. I'm going to go ahead and make a melee-based weapon attack. In this case, it's a miss, but let's, for the sake of an example, say that it actually hit. If I have Destructive Wrath available and I choose to use it, then I would select this effect and simply click that on our character. However, if I don't, I would simply add this effect to our character. And when you see it on your character sheet, you'll see the difference between the two effects. This one's simply going to apply 8 thunder damage. This one is simply going to make a roll. I'm going to use the roll as an example. Once I've got the effect added to our character, I've yet to roll damage against the Archmage, so now that is something that I have to do. You will see that we will have our normal damage dice rolled, but in addition to that, we will have an additional die that is rolled. If you used Destructive Wrath and applied this, when you went and roll this, you'll still only get the 1 damage roll, but you will actually have an additional amount of damage thrown onto the actual target there. And in this case, they are resistant to that because this weapon is not really magical. And you can tell that that bonus worked because normally our weapon adds a +2 to the damage, whereas here we had a +10 that was applied to the damage. So it took the full 8 here, added this 2, and gave us the +10. At Cleric level 9, your character is going to gain access to the last of their domain-specific spells. So I'm going to go ahead and minimize all of these so that we can gain access to them. There we go. And I'm simply going to drop these, oops, I didn't want to grab that, these into place. There are some minor adjustments that we have to make here. In fact, we only have to make one adjustment, and that's this thunder damage thing here. Because this can do thunder damage, we want to make sure that we have a maximum damage reference here, if you will, in place and ready to go for us. In this case, it's going to be 30 points of thunder damage. And this way, we can actually choose to use this or this, depending on whether we have access to our Channel Divinity feature, Destructive Wrath. But that does complete the addition of all spells we're going to gain through this particular feature, which means we are done with this feature. At Cleric level 14, there's an adjustment we have to make to Divine Strike because it goes from 1d8 thunder damage to a total of 2d8 thunder damage. So what we will want to do is pop this open with respect to our character's action sheet, minimize everything else, and modify the effects of what this can do. So instead of it being 1d8, that goes to 2d8. On top of that, this value can now change to a maximum of 16 points of damage. However, that will be the final modification that we have to make for Divine Strike. There's no additional bonuses that we're going to gain from it. And finally, at Cleric level 17, your character is going to gain access to the Stormborn feature, which grants your character some flying capabilities. In this case, as long as your character is above ground, meaning that they're not in a cave, they're not in the Underdark or anything like that, and they are not inside of a building, they will be able to fly the same amount of distance that they can normally walk. In this case, because the feature is granting you an innate ability, you do not have to worry about falling down at the end of a turn, and can hover in space. And that's because you're essentially gaining a free flying capability that has a few limited restrictions, And those really make sense if you think about it for a moment, specifically when you take into account the class specialization that you're dealing with. It makes sense that your character is required to be outdoors in order to fly around, or at the very least have no roof over their head if they start flying while they're in a building. And as a cleric of the Tempest Domain, many of these spells and features gained all reflect that exposure to the outdoors. And this feature just sort of complements that as part of the process. Having said that, it does mean that your character can fly for an unlimited period of time while they are outdoors, and without really having to land, save for the normal reasons as to why your character might need to gain rest, i.e. exhaustion, for example. Unfortunately, however, this isn't a feature that we need to worry about adding to our character's action sheet here. And at best, all we can really do is simply indicate to the Dungeon Master that we do have the ability to fly. And for that, you're going to want to do this under Special Move. This is completely informational. It will appear in your character's information sheet when you're added to the combat tracker so that the Dungeon Master can see that. However, all it really states is that you do have the ability to fly while you're moving around. And in this case, it lines up with the 25 feet of movement that you have here with respect to your speed. But that does complete all of the features that your character is going to gain through this class specialization. A cleric of this domain is a perfect character to have alongside on many different kinds of adventures. The catch is most of those have to be outdoors. While many of their base class specific spells will be functional within areas that are considered underground or in buildings, a lot of these features that the character has gained, or a lot of the spells that this character has gained, kind of do require that character to be out in an open space or have approximately 100 foot or more of ceiling above them before they can actually make use of the spells. Call Lightning, for example, is a perfect example of that. This means that they would be perfect on adventures that take place on the open seas, in wide open spaces, fields, forests, anywhere that is considered outdoors. They aren't useless, however, if someone has to go into a building or into an underground kind of adventure. So don't feel like you have to be restricted with respect to that. However, this does bring us to the end of this video. I hope you found it useful and informative, and I look forward to seeing you in the next one. I want to thank you for watching this video, and if you found the information useful, click on that like button as well as leave a comment below, as it helps the channel gain exposure. Also, consider subscribing, as I release content similar to this topic quite regularly on the channel.